Russia's invasion of Ukraine, according to the official pronouncement, is intended to serve denazification purposes. Even back in 2014, it was claimed Nazis and fascists were committing or planning genocide against Slavic people. When NATO interfered in the Balkans in the 1990s, which used to be Soviet turf during the Cold War, Russian propaganda again claimed a Nazi plot. Whenever the term is used, its true meaning is oftentimes non-Slavic white people, especially Anglo-Saxons. This aversion goes back as far as 7th centuries and became ingrained in Russian thinking. Alexander Nevsky was a prince about 700 years ago in the forerunner of the Russian Empire, the Kievan Rus, a starting point for modern-day Ukraine as well. He has been since proclaimed a saint who kept intact the Russian statehood and the Russian Orthodox Church, which is an offshoot of the Eastern Roman Church, and managed the complicated relationship with the so-called Golden Horde. In the so-called Battle of Lake Peipus on April 5th, 1242, a Russian army led by Prince Alexander Nevsky annihilated a force of the Livonian Order, the union of the Teutonic Order and the Order of the Brothers of the Sword, putting an end to their eastward expansion. The so-called Teutonic Order was not too different from the Knights Templars, which is a way more commonly known order, and it also goes back to the time of the Crusades. Had the Teutonic Order succeeded back then, Russia may be pretty much a white country these days. And it's sort of a cruel historic irony that the modern czars at some point were Germanic royal families or aristocratic families, such as the House of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein. This created the hybrid house of Schleswig-Holstein-Romanov-Gottorp. And these czars officially ruled Russia until the Communist Revolution. The Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein created a cinematic portrait of Nevsky in 1938 with his film Alexander Nevsky. This seminal work, to which Sergei Prokofiev composed the music, portrays the German knights as brutal invaders who eventually sink into the ice. Pure white devils, so to say. In the German-Soviet War, the screenings served Stalinist propaganda, since the Russian defense against the Knights of the Order could be interpreted as a parallel to the fight against the Nazi Wehrmacht. Now, in modern times, NATO is synonymous with the diabolical Teutonic Knights or the Nazis who invaded the Soviet Union and laid siege to Putin's parents' hometown of Leningrad. Because of the German devils, Vladimir Putin had to grow up surrounded by rats, a lot of depressed people, and a lack of everything. For obvious reasons, America's white upper classes today look distinctly Northern European or German. The victory of the Red Army over the German Wehrmacht and over fascism is a national fetish in Russia and in leftist circles worldwide to this day. This victory was made possible, however, by the enormous supplies of material from the Americans. The so-called Lend and Lease program made it possible for the United States, which was still officially neutral but already de facto involved in World War II, from an international legal perspective, to deliver essential war materials such as weapons, ammunition, vehicles, food, aircraft, etc. to the British and Russians. Great Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and many other countries received goods with a total value of almost $50 billion as a result of the Lend-Lease program. If the transport costs were included, the amount would be much higher. In the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Lend-Lease Act is described as practically a declaration of war by the United States on Germany, and Winston Churchill also described the measure as such in his first reaction. A lot of people internationally from conservative circles or even extreme right-wing circles were surprised and shocked when they heard the official justification for the Ukraine war, which was denazification. And so many suggested or outright claimed that Russia was not really talking about Nazis, or primarily talking about Nazis, but they were instead talking about the mythical, non-existent elders of Zion. So in that sense, Russia is supposedly trying to rid Ukraine from this Jewish world domination influence. And it's not primarily ridding Ukraine from the influence of white people of Anglo-Saxon origin. But this is only a diversion. Now, Russia itself created vast parts of this Elders of Zion myth through the so-called Protocols of Zion. Now, this text was put together by Russian intelligence about 100 years ago. And of course, the British colonial empire used a variety of puppets, some of which were Jewish, but this was a very large empire. It stretched all over the world. And so you had puppets in India. You had puppets in China for a long time when this was the colonial playground of Britain. And in Europe, you had a variety of puppets working for the British Empire. For example, you had Barings Bank, and the Barings family originally came from Germany, from Hanover, where also a wide range of British kings came from. Starting in 1714 with King George I, and then came King George II and III. Those were the Hanover kings. So they essentially took a privileged family from Hanover, Barings, and turned them into a private big merchant bank that was supposed to look like a private business that is not secretly run by the government. But chances are this was all just a big cartel, and this was run with basic intelligence methods. Covert methods. And then, of course, you had the infamous Rothschild banking family, which was a very, very tiny banking family. And they were built up by the aristocratic line of Hessen-Kassel, which is closely related to the British throne. And its vast family network. And Hessen has also been the czarist throne of Russia. So it's not very hard to recruit people, and they play the bankers, and they try to get as much attention, public attention, as they can. They build some larger palaces and so on and so forth. Now, this is kind of what the Russians had done after 1991, the end of the Soviet Union. The KGB, the main intelligence structure of Russia, the KGB created fake oligarchs, and they don't really own the money, they don't really have the control, but they are supposed to deal internationally and be the face of Russia. Now, the Nazis didn't really invent extremist views on the white race or the Anglo race or the Northern European heritage. This sort of thinking had been cultivated for many, many centuries by the aristocracy of Europe. So you had different main lines of aristocracy, and they all wanted to be the successor of the old Roman Empire. And they used Roman techniques, they used Roman architecture. That's why all these palaces in Europe look distinctly Roman. Whether you visit Austria, and this used to be the Habsburg line, you see Roman temples. If you go to Germany, you see various types of Roman temples. You go to Britain, Roman temples. And you go to France, everything looks distinctly Roman. And so about 2,000 years ago, the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar hatched out a plan to invade Germanic territories or Gallic territories. So the plan was hatched. This military campaign was prepared for years. Then a pretext was generated. Supposedly these Gallic territories were a threat to Rome. And then the campaign was launched, and the initial plan was to kill a certain percentage of Gallic men and to take over the territory and then to force Roman culture onto this territory, which is pretty much what happened. That's why everything is very Roman here in Europe. And this kind of Roman imperialism hasn't really changed. So there are different types, there are different flavors. So it's especially Adolf Hitler when Hitler started to expand his empire, and he wanted it to be a Roman empire. So a lot of talk about Germanic heritage and the Germanic race, but Hitler's fascination was not with tribes running around in the woods. His fascination was ancient Rome, and that's why when you visit Nuremberg, you see Roman temples. You see Roman-style temples built by the Nazis. And so when Hitler made the choice to invade Poland and later made the choice to invade Ukraine at the time, the planning was pretty much as it was 2,000 years earlier. The military campaign was planned. You always had a pretext, and a specific percentage of the people to be invaded were scheduled to be killed. And then German culture, or Nazi culture, National Socialism, was supposed to be forced upon these conquered territories. And Russia today claims to be the third Rome, or the third iteration of the Roman Empire. And thus, we see a lot of similarities between Julius Caesar and the current campaign of Vladimir Putin, right? So the idea is to take over Ukraine as much as they can, to kill a certain amount of Ukrainian men, mostly, and then to force Russian culture onto Ukraine. As in pretty much any country on this earth, you could find some neo-Nazis in Ukraine for the last, let's say, 30 years. But this is a really, really small number of people, and they're not really influential. And especially the Azov battalion has been named quite a lot. It's somewhat meaningful in a military sense, but apparently only the hardcore of the battalion is hardcore neo-Nazi. Politically, neo-Nazis do not hold any significant political power. It's a very small minority, and this doesn't really surprise us given the old occupation of Ukraine by the Nazis and the way that people were treated. President Zelensky has a Jewish background, so apparently he's one of the few people whose parents or grandparents were not all murdered by the Nazis, and so Zelensky's career was partially funded by oligarchs with a Jewish background. But of course, that's not the only background you should be looking at. Whenever you're dealing with an oligarch who controls important businesses in a country and who finances important politicians, you always have to look for an intelligence background. And this intelligence background could be anything. You saw Russian intelligence trying to take control over Ukraine. You saw Western intelligence trying to take control. And it's really hard to get to the bottom sometimes when you look at an oligarch. Now, some people on the internet, they will give you sort of an easy answer. They will say, well, Jewish oligarchs means elders of Zion. But the elders of Zion don't exist. And therefore, you have to actually make an effort to determine who is who in Ukraine and who is playing for what side. As you have probably seen on television or on the internet, Russia's military campaign currently is not going well at all, but this may change pretty quickly. Now, Russia can solidify its gains, and they can resupply and improve the supply lines, and they can prepare for another major operation. The peace talks may just be a smokescreen to buy some time until the new Russian offensive gets launched. But to have an offensive like this, without resorting to biological weapons or chemical or nuclear, to succeed, Russia sort of needs China. And China has a very, very interesting and very secret relationship with Russia, because the Chinese communists who did the revolution, they were all Russian assets. If you look up any sort of meaningful Chinese revolutionary, they were all trained by Russian schools, by Russian training facilities. And Russia, of course, tried to maintain as much control as possible. So you saw a lot of cleansing of communist parties in the entire Soviet Union over the years, meaning intelligence circles really took a look at who was pro-Moscow and who wasn't. And those people not so loyal to Moscow were oftentimes identified and then replaced. And so we are watching the situation, of course, what China will do. Will they resupply Russia with munitions and technical parts and pieces which Russia desperately needs, food supplies, and all these logistical things necessary to sustain a campaign? We also saw a new rocket launch by North Korea. And subsequently, there is talk about a possible new nuclear detonation test, an underground test by North Korea in the next few weeks. And Kim Jong-un, North Korea's crazy dictator, comes from a family line of alleged singular rulers that goes back to his grandfather Kim Il-sung, who was recruited by the Soviet military during the Stalin era. It is highly unlikely that Soviet Russia ever lost or relinquished control of North Korea. If Moscow pulls the strings today, the current missile test would be a clever way to herald a second theater of war that could draw American attention and ease the situation in Ukraine for Russia. Because if North Korea gets involved in things, China gets involved in things. And if Kim Jong-un is just a puppet, he can be discarded. He can be blamed for launching something. And China can claim innocence. Russia can claim innocence. Now, the true command structure in North Korea is a secret. Imperial Japan, something of a nemesis to Russia, but not as much as white people from Europe, had occupied Korea in the early 20th century and was attempting to wipe out the country's culture. Where have we heard that one before? Kim Il-sung was associated with the Chinese Communist Party, which at the time was a rebel group controlled by Soviet Russia. His mentor, Wei Zhengmin, reported directly to the notorious intelligence officer Kang Sheng, who headed the Chinese intelligence service for decades, particularly after the Chinese Communist Revolution. To the smarter observers at the time, it seemed more like a Soviet-Russian revolution in China. The key Chinese officials had been educated at Russian institutions, and their loyalty to Moscow was constantly scrutinized. Especially Mao. He implemented a policy which was a verbatim copy of Stalin's policy. There was nobody more Stalinist than Mao. Considered a talent among guerrilla leaders, Kim Il-sung was pursued by Japanese troops and escaped across the Amur River to the Soviet Union with what was left of his army. Kim was sent to a camp in Vyatskoye near Khabarovsk, where the Soviets continued to train Korean communist guerrillas. In August 1942, Kim and his army were assigned to a special unit known as the 88th Separate Rifle Brigade, affiliated with the Soviet Red Army. Kim rose to the rank of major in the Soviet Red Army and served there until the end of World War II in 1945. The notorious Lavrentiy Beria recommended Kim Il-sung to Stalin. with the caveat that Kim spoke Korean very poorly and badly needed training to even be able to give a public speech. So he was almost the ideal puppet, but he needed some work. Japan was defeated in World War II and Stalin's Soviet Union occupied part of Korea. Stalin equipped the Korean Communist forces with modern Soviet-built tanks, trucks, artillery, and small arms. Kim also created an air force, initially armed with Soviet propeller fighters and attack aircraft. The initiative for attacking the South ultimately came from Stalin. So as you can see, a lot of things are not quite what they seem. There's a lot of obfuscation about the nature of different empires and the relationship between those empires. So for example, the Anglo Empire is very, very traditional. It's very white Anglo-Saxon Roman style. But they have sort of adapted the Roman model of occupying territory and taking over populations and then allowing those populations partial autonomy. But those people are under constant surveillance. And so this was kind of the clever gift that kept on giving. So the people in the Anglo-sphere viewed themselves as more free, and they had more freedom, and they could use that freedom to start companies and corporations and invent things and all kinds of things that were useful to the empire. And of course, there was more tax money to take if the people actually produced more things that were needed. During the Cold War, the Anglos marketed themselves as conservative or more conservative leaning against the Eastern communism. And since 1991, the roles kind of reversed, or let's say the marketing flipped. So now the Anglos pretend to be more left-wing, while Russia pretends to be conservative. While in essence, communism in the real world was nothing more than traditional imperialism. So socialism simply meant over-regulation of the people and over-taxation. And this wasn't too much different from the old empires of Europe and serfdom, where you as a citizen, or 90% of citizens, you were a serf and you had to work the fields and then pay taxes to the aristocracy. And with that tax money, the aristocracy financed its lifestyle and its military to stay in control and to expand the empire. And so when communism hit in Russia and when communism hit in China, serfdom was the reality. So the difference was that the ground, the area that you worked on, was no longer officially owned by an aristocrat. It was officially owned by everyone and controlled by the party. But the work was still as hard. You still were overregulated and overtaxed. And in a medieval serfdom, the family unit was partially supported by the government because the family had to work the fields, but there wasn't much time for family life, to enjoy the family and to make the family stronger and to expand. So conservatives may believe that older is always better and that tradition was better and anything modern is just destroying the family. Any sort of dictatorship can ruin family bonds to serve the state, to make people weaker so the state grows stronger. The superpowers today, the United States, Russia, and China, they all have common roots, especially if you look at the intelligence history of it. And they always would benefit from having a secret cartel because they need the drama. This is the only way they can exert that much control and they can take that much taxpayer money. It's the only way they can maintain that level of militarization. And the drama is the only way to keep any other country down, any potential competitor. Imagine what would have happened if Russia had grown really weak after the end of communism. If Russia had become weak, next would have been NATO or the United States Empire to grow very weak. And then all these competitors would have tried to gain more power and more sovereignty. The Japanese, the Turks, the French, the Germans, African countries that have vast resources, and even Afghanistan, they have a lot of lithium, and on and on and on. You would have all these competitors who want a piece of the power. And only a secret cartel of the superpowers could maintain that superpower status for the United States, Russia, and China. So there's things that we know, and then there are the known unknowns. And this takes a lot of effort to figure out what you actually don't know. And then there are the unknown unknowns. These are things, questions that you're not even aware of, that these questions exist, let alone what the answers are. So if you're an American citizen, if you're conservative, you have to expect certain types of covert operations that are meant to get you in trouble. If you get in bed with the Russians, then you are liable, then you can be punished, you could even go to prison. If you try to break up the Union, you will get into trouble. And if you actually get into a fight, a physical fight with non-right-wing people, then you will just create chaos. And that sort of chaos is what benefits Russia. Russia today is nothing else but Soviet Russia without Marxism-Leninism. Right? They don't need Marxism-Leninism. Russia will tell you what you want to hear. And you want to hear that there's help, that there's a good superpower out there, that there's a friend out there that you can rely on. And that friend, that ally, is highly organized, and they know what they're doing. And they have all this power. This is what you want to believe, and this is what you are being told. But right now we see the weakness of Russia. So they can't really produce things on a mass scale reliably. Their structure is very, very rotten. And many soldiers that are now fighting in Ukraine, they come from very poor backgrounds. And most people who can afford it, they avoid military service. And so the more Russia needs the help of communist China, the more you will see this represented in the propaganda. So conservative influencers or influencers who claim to be conservative, they will at some point try to convince you that it is serving conservative interests to make deals with communist China.